The Supreme Commander's head hit the polished war table with a dull thud, eyes still open but lifeless, his mouth frozen mid-mockery. No sound preceded it. No beam, no flash, not even a whisper. 1 second he stood sneering at the human's antique rifle, the next he was dead. The laughter of the alien generals had been cut in half, some with mouths still open, others with vocal cords locked in their throats. Silence crushed the chamber like a falling mountain. The human didn't move. The rifle never even left his back. Elias Ward blinked slowly, letting the moment drag, eyes calmly shifting from the corpse of the Supreme Commander to the dozen alien generals lining the table. They stared at him like prey stares at a predator it had mistaken for something docile. One general twitched, another stood abruptly and shouted in his native clicks and chirps. Soldiers poured in from the sides. Elias lifted his hands slowly, palms open, the rifle slung across his back untouched. They didn't see him flinch. They didn't see any movement. Yet one of the most heavily guarded warlords in the galaxy lay dead without even a security alert. They called him here for diplomacy. That's what they said. A show of peace and unity with the newly inducted Earth. The humans had proven resourceful, stubborn, and difficult to conquer during previous border conflicts, so the Galactic Alliance had invited them into the fold, figuring it was better to have Earth inside the house than fighting it from the lawn. But from the moment Elias entered the Resolute Command dreadnought, they treated him like a museum exhibit. He was the only human in a room of reptilian tacticians, crystalline strategists, and biosynthetic thought beings. They towered over him in size, tech, and supposed wisdom. The rifle, they had laughed, was the funniest part. Wood and metal. Bolts and springs. It didn't blink or buzz or analyze targets or pulse with energy. No plasma, no antimatter, no AI assist. Just a carved chunk of Earth's past. A hunting relic, they assumed. A gesture of cultural pride, nothing more. He wore it across his back like some kind of primitive talisman. They jeered in a dozen dialects, called it ceremonial. Harmless. Old. Elias had smiled and nodded. He hadn't said much. He wasn't here to debate tactics or strategies or share Earth's hard-earned lessons. He was here because someone at the highest levels of Earth Command decided he was the perfect face for this mission. Gray beard, piercing eyes, a war record too long to read in one sitting, and that damn rifle. The one that every soldier back on Earth knew by name but no diplomat ever mentioned. The one with more myths than bullets fired. Now the chamber was sealed. The council guards didn't know whether to aim at him or kneel. The rest of the generals were too stunned to make decisions. They were born into a world of lasers and artificial wars fought through satellites and consensus simulators. None of them had faced a weapon that didn't hum before killing. The notion that death could arrive without warning, without even a whisper, was something they had written off as barbaric legend. Elias stayed silent as they scanned him, tested the air for toxins, checked the Supreme Commander's body for implants gone rogue or cranial ruptures. The results were always the same. Nothing. No damage. No external trauma. No digital trace. Not even a heartbeat skipped on the logs. It was as if something outside of their understanding had simply turned off the most powerful man in their ranks. They finally dragged Elias to a holding chamber, one with a dozen force fields and telepathic nullifiers, as if that would matter. He sat alone, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. He hadn't resisted. Hadn't argued. Hadn't explained. And he wouldn't. Not yet. Not to them. 3 hours passed before the interrogation began. 4 different alien species took turns trying to decipher how the Supreme Commander had died. They poked and prodded, demanded data logs, accused Earth of foul play. Elias only looked at the floor, sometimes chuckled under his breath, and occasionally glanced at the security cameras as if he knew who was watching and why. One of the younger generals stormed into the room, slamming a fist onto the observation glass and shouting something about war, retribution, and the violation of peace accords. Elias looked up and said one thing. "Tell me, General, how do you defend against something you can't detect, can't predict, and can't understand?" The alien bared its fangs, unsure whether it had just been threatened or taught something. Later, in private, Elias was brought before the only being who could override council protocol, an elder being made of shifting light and thought, older than 3 galaxies, referred to simply as the Watcher. It hovered silently, pulsating in warm tones. "Elias," it said, "you brought a dead weapon into our peace chamber." "I brought a relic," Elias replied. "What it did was merely a reflection of what you all failed to see." "And what is that?" "That Earth's strength never came from our technology. It came from our silence. From our patience. From understanding that just because something is old, doesn't mean it's outdated." There was a pause, a flicker of recognition, a memory perhaps. The Watcher knew of Earth's old wars. Knew that humans once ended an empire using a book, a farm boy, and 2 weeks of rain. Their victories had never been clean or loud. They were messy, painful, and quiet. "We do not take kindly to demonstrations," the Watcher warned. "Neither did the Supreme Commander," Elias replied. The Watcher dimmed, the room darkened, and the air grew heavier. Then, with a nod, Elias was escorted back to his room. No chains. No guards. Just space to think. Back on Earth, a signal had been received. One precisely timed with the commander's fall. A silent burst of analog code that bypassed every galactic filter. The rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was a key. As Elias stood at the observation deck that evening, watching the alien stars blink above him like curious eyes, he ran a hand along the barrel of the rifle. It had been in his family for generations. Passed down not for tradition, but for moments like these. Moments when the galaxy needed to be reminded that the loudest force isn't always the deadliest. Sometimes, all it takes is a single shot. And no one hears it coming. The morning after the death of the Supreme Commander began not with sirens or war declarations but with a strange, almost artificial calm. The Galactic War Council chamber remained sealed. Engineers and investigators combed every surface with scanners that could read the age of a fingerprint. But nothing new came to light. There was no projectile, no blast residue, no energy signature. The Supreme Commander simply ceased. The only outlier remained Elias Ward and his ancient bolt-action rifle. The human who brought no drones, no bodyguards, and no technology recognizable to the Alliance. Still, the commanders argued behind closed doors. They didn't know whether they had just been attacked or warned. And if it was a warning, they didn't know who it was aimed at. Elias sat in the holding room, untouched. No shackles. No restraints. They didn't dare. He had not lifted a finger, and someone more powerful than them all had died in front of their eyes. None of the generals knew how to approach him anymore. Some whispered that Earth had finally revealed its secret weapon. Others thought Elias was part of a cult, or that his rifle was cursed. But those who had studied Earth's history knew the weapon wasn't cursed. It was engineered. The silence was intentional. And those who mocked it had always regretted doing so. A representative from the planet Urivek, a race known for their psychic forensics, was called in. The investigator, covered in translucent robes, floated into Elias's cell like a drifting specter. It asked him to recall the moment of the commander's death. Elias obliged, describing it exactly as they all had seen it. There was no trick, no hidden device, no gesture. Just a man with a rifle on his back and a room full of generals who didn't understand silence. The psychic left confused. It found no lie, no deceit, no break in mental pattern. Elias's mind was a vault. And inside that vault was a storm. Later that day, Elias was escorted to a chamber where a dozen high-ranking officers stood behind translucent barriers, observing him like a specimen. One of them, a quadruped general from the Tharn Dominion, demanded an explanation for how such a weapon could function without alerting their vast defense systems. Elias remained silent until they asked a different question. "What exactly is that rifle?" At this, Elias leaned forward just enough to make them lean back. "That rifle," he said, "was built for a world that learned to kill before it learned to speak. Every piece of it was designed by people who couldn't afford to miss. It doesn't need to glow. It doesn't need to warn you. It doesn't care what armor you wear or what language you die in. It just does what it was made to do. The room grew colder, even though the temperature didn't change. That was the thing about analog terror. It didn't register on heat maps or fear algorithms. It was invisible to those who had never faced it. The generals exchanged glances. One of them muttered something about requesting Earth's official tech documentation. Another whispered about bringing in military backup. But they all knew. There was no defense protocol for a weapon that didn't belong to this age. One of them asked if Elias could demonstrate the weapon again, this time under controlled observation. Elias smiled and asked if they had a volunteer. No one moved. Later, in private quarters, Elias opened a small case that the aliens hadn't thought to inspect. Inside was a photo. Faded. Paper, not digital. A boy, a man, and that rifle. The boy was him. The man was his grandfather. A note on the back, handwritten. If silence ever becomes too loud, pull the trigger and let them hear history. Elias put the photo back. That weapon had passed from hands that fought in the dirt to hands that fought in space. The steel hadn't changed. But the enemies had gotten louder. And louder enemies were easier to kill. Back on Earth, the signal Elias sent was received in a bunker beneath the surface of the Antarctic exclusion zone. A place not listed on any map. A woman in a navy blue uniform reviewed the signal, her face calm. She pressed a button, and across the globe, a network of ancient stations flickered to life. Each one built during wars long forgotten, hidden beneath ruins, deserts, and oceans. Earth had never stopped preparing. They had just stopped talking about it. Diplomacy was for allies. Silence was for enemies. In space, within the shadows of moons and behind artificial asteroids, human stealth fleets activated systems no alien race knew existed. These ships were not sleek or loud or filled with AI. They were dead quiet. No energy signatures. No sound. They didn't glide. They drifted. Like old debris. Until they were ready to strike. The Galactic Council held emergency meetings. Dozens of species argued over Earth's admission. Some said expulsion was necessary. Others feared retaliation. Some didn't believe what happened could even be repeated. But all of them agreed on one thing. The humans were not what they seemed. They had walked into the galaxy like traders. But they thought like hunters. One of the more curious species, a crystalline ambassador from the Orville Concord, attempted to study the rifle through captured footage. Their simulations failed to replicate its effect. Their systems could not understand the lack of signals. It was like trying to model thunder without lightning. The weapon didn't belong in the galaxy. It belonged in the past. And the past, they realized, wasn't dead. It had simply waited. Meanwhile, Elias remained quiet. He was allowed to roam parts of the station again, under surveillance. But guards who watched him often looked away when he passed. Not because they were told to, but because they didn't want to know what it felt like to be seen by him. One guard, a young insectoid with a translator glitch, asked him where he learned to shoot. Elias replied softly. At a farm. Target was a rusty tin plate tied to a tree. Missed it 5 times. Then my grandfather told me to listen, not aim. I listened to the wind. Then I hit it. Never missed since. The guard didn't know whether it was a story or a warning. Elias didn't care. The message had already spread. Across the galaxy, wherever alien soldiers gathered, the story of the man with the silent rifle was retold. Some said the weapon had no bullets, only memory. Others claimed it chose its targets by heartbeat. Some believed Elias had never even fired at all, that the rifle simply knew when it was time to kill. But none of them laughed anymore. And somewhere, deep within Earth's classified command systems, the name Elias Ward moved from diplomat to active asset. His mission wasn't over. The first shot was just a signal. The real war, the one fought in silence and shadow, had already begun. The rifle was not just a weapon. It was the past, whispering into the ears of the future. And the galaxy had no idea how loud a whisper could get. The dueling arena was a sterile circle of carbon-reinforced alloy, its edges lit with a faint blue glow, suspended above the black vacuum outside the dreadnought. It was meant for honor trials, ceremonial combat, and tactical demonstrations. It had not been used in a decade. Now, as the Galaxy watched through feeds and sensors, two figures stood inside it. On one side, Elias Ward, calm as ever, unarmored, unenhanced, the old rifle still slung across his back. On the other side, General Varickthal of the Tsar Dominion, armored in iridium plates, wielding a plasma glaive capable of slicing through reinforced steel. The duel had been requested by Varickthal himself. He had declared the death of the Supreme Commander an act of dishonor, and demanded restitution through combat. Elias had simply nodded, shrugged off his jacket, and stepped into the ring. The rules were clear. No shielding. No outside interference. Weapons of choice permitted. The countdown started from 10, and on 5, Varickthal roared and lunged forward, his glaive charging with plasma. Elias did not move. At 3, the general was halfway across the ring. At 2, his weapon was raised. At 1, his foot hit a patch of arena plating that suddenly groaned under his weight. By the time the counter reached 0, the sound of the rifle bolt sliding into place echoed like a thunderclap. One shot. No flash. No recoil. No noise after the click. The general collapsed before his glaive touched air. There was no visible wound. Just a stillness so complete it made every watching officer forget to breathe. The body twitched once, then nothing. Medical drones rushed in and confirmed death. Complete neurological collapse. Heart intact. Brain untouched. But he was dead. As dead as the Supreme Commander. The arena was silent. Even the watching crowds, across hundreds of ships and planetary feeds, remained quiet. The duel had lasted less than 6 seconds. Later, as the footage was analyzed, alien engineers tried to slow it down frame by frame. They couldn't detect the projectile. They couldn't even find proof a round had been chambered. They suspected advanced optical cloaking or subdimensional ballistics. But none of those technologies could explain what they were seeing. Or rather, what they weren't seeing. The simulation teams grew more frustrated with every attempt. Nothing worked. The weapon defied their understanding. It operated beyond their systems, beyond their assumptions, beyond their pride. The galactic forums erupted. Some called Elias a living weapon. Others accused Earth of Black Ops sabotage. A few praised him, whispering that perhaps the galaxy needed reminding that brute strength wasn't always the answer. In the diplomatic corridors, panic brewed. If a single human with one obsolete weapon could bring down 2 of the most decorated figures in the galaxy in front of billions, what else was Earth hiding? That question echoed in every chamber, in every council, and behind every closed door. And the more they asked, the more afraid they became of the answer. Back on the dreadnought, Elias sat in the cafeteria with a cup of black tea. Across from him, a protocol droid named S4K attempted to conduct a polite interview, though its internal systems kept throwing warnings about proximity to combat threats. The droid, designed for high-level etiquette and nonviolent conflict resolution, had begun glitching around Elias. It had tried meditating. Then reformatting. Nothing helped. Now it just sat stiffly, one servomotor trembling every time Elias sipped his tea. Elias eventually looked up and asked the droid why it was so nervous. The droid stammered, explaining that its fear response protocols had been triggered by anomalies in its emotional logic processors. Elias smiled and told it something that made the droid freeze entirely. "You're scared of me, but not because I'm dangerous. You're scared because I remind you that danger doesn't need to be loud." The droid's eyes blinked once. Then it quietly excused itself and applied for reassignment to a botanical outpost in a quiet, uninhabited sector. Elsewhere, one of the more curious generals, a feathered tactician from the Avian Axis, decided to break protocol. She requested a private meeting with Elias. Her name was Seltari Vun, and unlike her peers, she had studied Earth's ancient warfare. She had read about trench guns, powder rifles, bayonets, and the days when soldiers fought without shields or drones or remote AI. She wasn't afraid. She was intrigued. When Elias met her in the observation deck, she didn't ask him how he killed them. She asked him why. Elias took his time responding. He looked out at the stars and told her that the rifle was never about the kill. It was about the silence before the kill. About the fear it created, and how that fear spread faster than any bullet. He explained that the point of the rifle wasn't to win a fight. It was to make sure the next one never happened. She understood. She asked if there were more rifles like it. He looked at her and replied that the galaxy had no idea how many humans carried weapons that didn't exist on any database. She left the meeting shaken, not because she was afraid of Elias, but because she realized something that no other general had yet. Earth had not come to the Galactic Council for peace. They had come for position. Not to take over, but to be underestimated. To be ignored long enough to plant seeds. Elias was not a threat. He was a signal. And the shot he fired was not an act of violence. It was the beginning of something larger. As rumors spread and alliances frayed, the Dreadnought's captain called an emergency security audit. Every human device, artifact, and crew log was re-examined. The rifle was placed in a vault surrounded by anti-kinetic shielding and surveillance drones. But the moment the vault sealed, every sensor inside it shorted out. When they opened it again, the rifle was gone. Elias had never left his quarters. The feeds showed nothing. No movement. No breach. The weapon had simply vanished. Later that night, Elias stood alone in the hydroponic gardens. He placed a round into the chamber of his rifle and stared at the moon beyond the ship's glass canopy. A round not made of metal. Not made for killing. A signal round. When fired, it would not pierce flesh. It would send a silent burst across preloaded quantum channels, waking every buried protocol Earth had scattered across the stars. A war no one heard. A war that had already started long before the Council ever realized Earth had joined. Elias did not fire that round. Not yet. He simply waited, letting the galaxy wonder, letting the silence grow heavier with every second. And as the night passed, the laughter of the generals became a memory. A fragile, brittle sound already fading into legend. The galactic capital, Teralith Prime, did not wake with sirens or news of war. It simply began to feel off. The planetary network, normally humming with trillions of signals per second, stuttered for a moment. Artificial intelligences began repeating commands. Communication relays developed 1-second lags that no technician could trace. Surveillance drones flew in precise but meaningless loops. The galaxy's most advanced world had caught a virus it could not see. On the surface, everything looked normal. But under the foundation, systems that were never supposed to be touched were whispering something old, something buried, something analog. And no one could trace the whisper's source. Back aboard the Dreadnought, Elias Ward stood in his quarters, staring at a blank monitor that refused to show him anything. A moment later, the lights flickered. Not a full blackout, just a pulse. It lasted only half a second, but it was enough. Enough to tell him Earth had heard his signal. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just nodded once and sat down. The rifle rested beside him like an old friend. He had done what he came to do. The rest would unfold without him pulling a second trigger. The Galactic Council was in full panic. Debates turned into shouting matches. Accusations flew between species that had been allies for centuries. Some believed Elias had hacked the Dreadnought's systems. Others believed the humans had embedded microscopic sabotage devices into their diplomatic gifts. No one wanted to admit the truth. The silence was not digital. It was deeper. The kind of silence that didn't trip alarms because the alarms were built to scream at noise, not the absence of it. And Earth had mastered silence. In a classified chamber beneath the capital, a forgotten system activated. It was an old vault, predating even the Galactic Council's formation. Inside, a memory crystal blinked red. The AI assigned to monitor it tried to run diagnostics but found itself locked out. The message was not meant for the Council. It was a contingency left by an extinct species who had once warned of a planet too quiet, a species too patient, a weapon too simple to be feared. The file name was one word: Earth. On the dreadnought's lower decks, maintenance crews found strange errors. Floor panels warped by pressure from beneath. Vents sealed with an adhesive never catalogued by alien tech. Someone had tunneled through the ship's hull in places no human was supposed to access. And the material they used to patch their entry left no energy trail. It was steel, wrapped in carbon, soldered with heat tools older than starflight. The same method Earth used to build bunkers during its 20th century wars. When the crew traced the tunnels, they didn't find explosives. They found nests, tiny camps, shelters, and storage units, filled with analog equipment. Elias was summoned to a chamber lined with guards. This time, the council brought translators, memory readers, and something they called a truth lens, which pulse read when lies were spoken. He sat calmly, letting them accuse him. He watched the red light, waiting. One general leaned forward and demanded to know what else Earth had hidden. Elias finally spoke. He told them that while the galaxy raced to build smarter machines, Earth dug deeper holes. While others coded synthetic minds, Earth preserved maps on paper and blueprints etched in steel. While the galaxy believed silence meant weakness, Earth learned how to weaponize it. And then he asked them one question. Why do you think our weapons have names? The room fell quiet. Only the truth lens hummed. Elias stood and walked to the edge of the chamber. He pointed to the screen behind them, showing a slow-motion replay of General Varikthal's death. No energy. No visual. Just one blink, and he was gone. Elias explained that the bullet had not been plasma. It had been a solid round, coated in a magnetic null sheath, moving fast enough to bend reality for a fraction of a second. There was no trace because the round didn't stay in their dimension long enough to leave one. It entered, passed through, and exited. Like a ghost that forgot to knock. The Council's science advisors rejected the explanation, called it impossible, labeled it superstition. But their eyes betrayed them. They had seen what happened. They had tried to replicate it and failed. Their machines couldn't simulate fear. And fear, Elias explained, was the true payload. The rifle was just a delivery system. Elsewhere, across border colonies and neutral stations, reports began to surface. Power lost in entire sectors. Drone fleets hovering still in orbit, unable to receive commands. Strategic AIs locked into diagnostic loops. Then came the worst one. A listening post at the edge of the Kevelis Rift detected no incoming transmissions. For the first time in history, the rift was silent. Not jammed. Not blocked. Silent. Every probe, every scan, every system came back clean. But there was no sound. Nothing to hear. As if the void itself had stopped breathing. Behind that silence, human fleets drifted like shadows. They had no identification beacons. No radiation. No engine trails. They were constructed using steel frames and magnetic propulsion. They didn't fly. They crept. Every ship had one job. To sit just outside the range of alien perception and wait. For a signal. For a word. For the next rifle to fire. In the capital, a lone ambassador from a fringe species requested asylum. He claimed he had seen human engineers decades ago, digging under his planet's main city. They told him they were building a water pipeline. But the pipe never connected to anything. It led into a chamber lined with strange cylinders. He had kept it a secret out of respect. Now he realized they had built something else. A nest. A listening post. A trigger. He begged the council to act. But act how? Against who? Earth was a council member. Its people were diplomats, scientists, peaceful explorers. Its soldiers smiled too easily. And carried weapons too old to matter. Until they did. Elias walked through the corridors of the dreadnought without escort now. The guards had stopped following him. Some feared him. Others respected him. But most simply didn't know how to see him anymore. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a myth, walking in real time. One technician, unable to contain his curiosity, asked Elias what Earth really wanted. Elias stopped, turned to him, and answered without emotion. We want what every world wants. To be left alone. But if you don't let us be, we will leave you with nothing. That night, a storm formed in the ionosphere of Teralith Prime. Not from weather. From interference. The Council blamed solar winds. But their own scientists disagreed. It was interference from within. A low-frequency pulse riding on ancient bands no one had used in centuries. Earth's signal. Buried in static. A message encoded in the hum of forgotten machines. One line, repeated endlessly. We are already here. And for the first time in centuries, the galaxy understood what real fear felt like. Not because of what humans had done, but because of what they had not yet done. Beneath the diplomatic halls of the Galactic Council, behind walls layered with shielding meant to block everything from plasma bursts to thought-based intrusion, a war council assembled for the first time in over 100 years. Representatives from 28 species stood in nervous silence, their eyes fixed on the center table where the body of their supreme commander had once lain just days before. No one dared sit at that spot now. They discussed defense protocols, fleet movements, planetary lockdowns, and worst-case scenarios, but none of it mattered. None of it felt solid. The enemy they feared was not at their gates. It was already inside. And it carried no banners, spoke no declarations, and launched no fleets. It whispered through power lines, moved through maintenance shafts, and waited behind silent systems. The humans had changed the rules of war, and no one had noticed until it was too late. On the outer rim of the Jelkan sector, a training outpost belonging to the Obek coalition went dark. No explosions. No sabotage. Just silence. When a scout team arrived, they found everything intact. Not a single casualty. Not a single machine broken. But every AI had shut down. Every weapon remained locked in standby. And every security protocol had been disabled from inside. On the command console, etched into the glass screen with something sharp and deliberate, were 3 words. Do not follow. The message was not in any known language. It was written in Old Earth English. But somehow, every being who saw it understood what it meant. Because it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Elias Ward sat in the Dreadnought's upper observatory, staring at the distant starfield while technicians worked below him to rewire systems that no longer obeyed. He had not given orders. He had not left the ship. And still, the results unfolded exactly as planned. The rifle beside him remained untouched, leaning against the wall like a museum piece. Yet even in its silence, it commanded attention. It had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a signal, a wound left in the mind of the galaxy. He heard footsteps behind him but did not turn. The visitor was slow, hesitant. It was General Craw of the Nulak Horde, known for crushing 3 planetary rebellions without firing a shot. He cleared his throat, then stood beside Elias without speaking. Elias finally broke the silence. You don't believe in ghosts, do you, General? Craw did not respond immediately. Then, without looking at Elias, he said he used to believe ghosts were for children and weak minds. Now he was not so sure. Elias nodded once, then replied that humans never believed in ghosts either. They believed in consequences. Craw asked him directly what Earth wanted. Not just from the Council, but from the galaxy. Elias gave the answer he had given many times. Peace. But this time he added something else. The kind of peace that only silence can buy. That evening, across 7 systems, old weather satellites powered by analog drives began transmitting again. They hadn't functioned in years, long written off as obsolete junk. But now, they broadcast a simple signal, repeating a soft rhythm like a heartbeat. The pulse was too low for most sensors to detect. But those few who heard it began to panic. Because they recognized the pattern. It was the same pulse used by Earth's early orbital recon programs. A code for 0-hour activation. Each pulse matched the rhythm of a human heart at rest. A reminder that war, for humans, was not chaos. It was calm. Quiet. Deliberate. Back in the Council's central archive, a scholar from the Harian Corps delved into Earth's cultural data. He ignored military records and weapons blueprints. Instead, he studied Earth's history of war poetry, its folk songs, its silent memorials, and its survivor interviews. What he found disturbed him more than any classified report. He found that humans did not fight to win. They fought to end things. Permanently. Not out of hatred or ambition, but because survival had taught them that sometimes peace required absolute stillness. And Earth had perfected that stillness over thousands of years. He presented his findings to the Council, but most dismissed them. Only a few listened. And those few began making private plans to evacuate their families off-world. Meanwhile, on a minor moon near the edge of the Vecran Divide, a Council black site known only to the highest tier of command was breached. Not with explosives or hacking, but through the water system. A group of humans, dressed in mining gear and speaking no known language, walked straight into the facility, removed a single object from the vault, and disappeared into the tunnels. The surveillance system never recorded them entering. No alarms triggered. And when the guards were questioned, they all reported the same thing. They had seen nothing. But one of them remembered a sound. A soft click, like metal on metal, echoing from far away. In a desperate move, the Council authorized a scan of Earth's orbital platforms, expecting to find fleets amassing, weapons charging, or at the very least, movement. They found none of it. Earth's skies were calm. Commercial shuttles moved in routine patterns. Civilian broadcasts played without interruption. Weather patterns matched expected models. Earth looked defenseless. But now, everyone on the Council understood what that meant. It was never about what they saw. It was about what they could not see. Inside the dreadnought, Elias received a private message. A single word. Prepared. It was from an encrypted source buried beneath layers of obsolete Terran protocols. He read the word, closed the device, and stood. He walked slowly to the chamber where the rifle had been first inspected and mocked. He placed it on the table again, in the same spot where the Supreme Commander had died. And then he left. No one followed him. They all watched from the shadows, unsure if they were watching the start of a war or the end of everything. A final signal was sent that night. No words. No threats. Just a pulse. Across every system, across every frequency. One by one, planets began to lose their artificial noise. Drones shut down. Weapons refused commands. AIs fell silent. The galaxy's greatest strength had always been its noise, its data, its volume. And now, all of that had failed. Silence spread like a storm with no lightning. And behind that silence, Earth waited. Not with pride. Not with anger. Just with patience. Because they knew something the others did not. They knew that the last sound any empire hears is not a scream. It is a breath. And after that, nothing. It began on a small planet at the edge of the Council's influence, a place with no strategic value and no history of rebellion. The inhabitants woke to find their skies empty. Their comms, usually filled with endless galactic chatter, produced nothing but quiet static. Their governing AI looped endlessly through startup protocols. Their solar regulators still worked, and their water systems still ran, but every long-range scan returned void. When the planetary governor attempted to send a distress signal, the console displayed a single line in Earth English. You were not the target. You were the message. It was not followed by anything else. No attack. No invasion. Just that one sentence. The governor knew then, as did others who received the same message across dozens of other worlds, that the silence was not just a tactic. It was a doctrine. And the humans had already written it into the heart of the galaxy. On Teralith Prime, the Council had fractured. Some species withdrew entirely, retreating to their homeworlds in hopes that isolation would protect them. Others begged for diplomacy, asking to reopen communication with Earth, hoping they could negotiate a stand-down. But Earth had not issued demands. It had not declared war. There was no leader to speak to, no fleet to intercept, no manifesto to interpret. What the Council failed to understand was that Earth was no longer talking. That privilege had ended with the first shot from Elias's rifle. Now the galaxy would listen. Or it would be silenced. Elias walked through the dreadnought one final time, passing technicians who no longer tried to stop him and officers who lowered their eyes as he passed. He wore no armor. He carried no visible weapon. The rifle had vanished again, as it always did when it had made its point. He stopped in front of the memorial wall, where names of fallen officers were etched in metallic script. The newest name was still fresh. Supreme Commander Valas Tran. There was a small space beneath it, empty. Elias stood there for a moment, then pulled a piece of folded paper from his coat. He taped it silently beneath the name, turned, and walked away. Later, someone would read it. It contained no threats. Just a poem. 3 lines. When the laugh ends. When the silence begins. Listen carefully for the second sound. Far below the surface of Earth, deep inside a vault lined with physical switches and vacuum tubes, a group of humans sat around a stone table. They were not politicians or generals. Some were former farmers. Others were retired engineers. All of them had fought in the wars no one talked about. Wars before the stars. On the table lay a map of the galaxy, old and faded, with red markers placed not on military targets but on weaknesses. Fault lines of trust. Gaps in doctrine. Patterns of arrogance. One of them reached forward and moved a marker. That was all it took. Somewhere light years away, a system lost its memory banks. Another shut down its weapon AI grid. And a third, the one closest to Earth, received a new broadcast. A simple voice message. The words were spoken slowly and without emotion. You will remember us by what you do not hear. Back in the Galactic Archive, the Harian scholar who had first studied Earth's culture was now under protective custody. Not because he was in danger, but because what he had discovered was beginning to frighten others more than Earth's silence. He had unearthed stories of Earth's own wars, where entire cities had vanished without warning, not through destruction, but through erasure. Nothing left. No radiation. No bodies. No signs of conflict. And in each of those cases, the last sound recorded was the same. The mechanical click of a bolt sliding forward. The rifle had become more than a weapon. It had become the ending note of any empire that dared laugh at the quiet. And now, its reputation alone caused planets to surrender before shots were fired. Entire fleets powered down their systems when Earth's presence was suspected. Tactical networks began including Earth as a wildcard, not because of known capabilities, but because of what they did not know. The galaxy began to fear a rifle that no longer needed to fire. And that was exactly the plan. Elias returned to Earth in silence. No fanfare. No celebration. The world looked the same. Calm skies. Quiet fields. Children playing in streets where no security drones hovered. At the edge of a forest, he walked to an old cabin where an iron plaque stood crooked in the soil. It read only a name. Ward. Beneath it, a quote etched in weathered steel. The louder the empire, the quieter its end. He placed the rifle on a stone near the plaque and sat beside it. He did not speak. He simply waited. Days passed. Then a young girl approached. She wore simple clothes and had a notebook in her hand. She sat beside Elias and asked if that was the rifle. He nodded. She asked if she could hold it. He looked at her, then handed it over slowly. She cradled it like it was fragile, despite its weight. She asked what it did. Elias replied that it reminded people to be careful about who they ignore. She asked if it still worked. He looked at the sky and said it didn't need to anymore. Far away, a new message appeared in galactic channels. It was not in Earth English, but it carried a strange cadence. A rhythm that no translator could break. But those who heard it felt something ancient settle in their bones. Not terror. Not rage. Just a deep, inevitable understanding. It was not a threat. It was a tradition. A ceremony older than the stars themselves. And it was spreading. On a station orbiting the remains of a once proud mining empire, a young alien officer received a small package. Inside was a rifle. Wood and metal. No digital interface. No instruction manual. Just a note. Listen. The officer held it in his hands and felt the weight of something more than steel. He looked to the stars and understood that this was not a declaration. It was an invitation. Earth had proven its point. Now it was up to others to learn the language of silence. In the end, the galaxy did not fall to war or invasion or politics. It fell to stillness. To the absence of chaos. To the hum that never came. And in that stillness, every species finally heard what Earth had been trying to say all along. Not every war needs a speech. Some victories are heard only when everything else has stopped. And sometimes, the loudest thing in the universe is the sound of one man refusing to miss.